So in the end, it looks like the Merfolk are kind of out of the league when it comes to the things we accept as being human. In other words, there are very few people who will believe in Merfolk and sirens and mermaids in the same way that people believe in Bigfoot and Sasquatch because there seems to be a clear line to be crossed here in terms of a human being partly man or partly person or partly fish. We are certainly looking at something that would be markedly different from us. So the stories about merfolks were very easily or very quickly debunked over the years, as I showed with the idea of the indigenous person in Virginia, as many people thought about the manatees for Columbus. Or in the story from Heuvelmans that we have mentioned before in the context of Bigfoot, actually. He was looking at the Orang Pendek, the Malaysian quote unquote man of the woods, which turned out to be an ape. Here in the May 1833 issue of the Proceedings of the German Society of Natural History and Ethnography of Eastern Asia, published in Yokohama, Dr. Hilgendorf related that he had bought on the fish market of Edo a squid sword of an unusual side. He had also had the occasion in that same city to acquire the remains of a squid offered in public display whose length reached 4.28 meters, 1.86 meters for the body, 85 centimeters for the head, 1.97 meters for the longest arm preserved. The naturalist had at first sight taken the squid for a giant species of Omostrethes, but after reflection he described it in 1880 as a new genus under the name Megateuthis martinense. It was actually Architeuthis, which showed that this kind of squid was not restricted to the Atlantic Ocean, as one might have surmised until then. 15 years later, two Japanese zoologists, Mitsukuri and Ikeda, were to confirm the presence of those cephalopods in Japanese waters by announcing the discovery in Tokyo Bay of a minuscule Architeuthis. This was the smallest ever found. Its mantle measured only 72 centimeters. Its arm did not exceed 1.22 meters, and its tentacles 2.91 meters. The area of distribution of giant and supergiant squids was found year by year to be even more expansive in the wake of the publicity surrounding the Newfoundland stranding. Strongs gradually loosened. So this is kind of bouncing off of the conversation about these bishop fish who were caught over the years, or these fish that are looking like bishops but might be squids in fact, and of course is part of our understanding of the world around us that these giant squids were mostly taken to be fairy tales for a very long time, or legends, if you will, things that only a few people had seen, but very few people had experienced or caught or even had the opportunity to identify in a scientific way. And once again, this is only happening in 1873, about 150 years ago, when it was discovered that giant squids were real. And to give an idea of the numbers, if you are not well versed in metric, 1.86 meters is about 6'1" or so. So that would be the size of a human for the body of the largest squid once you remove the arms. And the arms, 1.97 would be, 6'5" or something like that. So the obviously the proportions are almost human-like once you do a little bit of work of maybe drying them or cutting the tentacles and whatever. So again, kind of trying to make sense out of the long history, the long line of natural species that we barely knew. Our merfolk will kind of fill in the blanks of these apparitions, these non-human, more than human, almost human characters that exist out there. And it may be a little too on the nose to point out that this whole conversation here is asking in the context of evolution, of course, because the evolutionary symbol has become the fish, and especially a fish with legs, such as this one, which is understood or used as the possibility of our ancient ancestors being a combination of a land animal and a fish animal, which obviously would not look anything like this. This is a cartoonish representation. This has no bearing in reality, but it is kind of interesting to see how this kind of representation looks very close to the idea of a bishop fish, just a slightly more stylized version of it. But the the question of whether there's a possibility of a uh, so the connection between our belief in something supernatural and in science, and whether those two are able to meet halfway through, give us these kinds of characters, which may look a little bit more confusing than they need to. Again, sometimes closer to a dragon, sometimes closer to the Genianiverse, the fake fish type things. All of those different characters would be kind of a missing link in our imagination. But the representation here is important, and especially if you don't have a pictorial art to make sense out of it, the evolution of these sirens looking like birds at first, and then looking like half fish, and then looking like this representation here from the 19th century, and from a human zoo, again, one of those quote unquote freak shows where not quite human things and perhaps not quite animal things were displayed for all to see. This engraving here is from a person who saw a quote unquote mermaid at the centenary exhibition in London, and kind of drew a quick sketch, and that sketch was circulated as evidence, as representation of what this thing is. And if you did not have the opportunity to see this firsthand, or if you, for example, are in 2023 sitting in your living room seeing this picture, you might have some questions about what that person saw actually, and whether this is a faithful representation. But it could only just jiggle your mind a little bit to think about what this thing might have been. That being said, because we have a very long history of making stories, as has been pointed out before, and those stories turning out to be partly rooted in reality, partly rooted in fantasy, it is very easy to see how we make some shortcuts between the past that we may have and the ideals that may exist outside in the world, and perhaps the combination of those that may or may not happen, which could be an accident, could be on purpose, again in the context of evolution. This example here is from Timaeus, from Plato, so dated from the 4th century before Common Era, discovery of the island of Atlantis. So this is one of the earliest record we have of Atlantis. This is, as usual, in a conversation between Socrates and other quote unquote dignitaries. Of course, this is an imagined conversation. Plato does not hide that. But here, a person is a dignitary of ancient Greece is describing the city, country, island of Atlantis. In this island of Atlantis, there existed a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the islands and over many other islands also, and parts of the continent. And moreover, of the lands here within the straits, they rolled over Libya again, and as far as Egypt, and over Europe as far as Tuscany, so Italy. So this host, being all gathered together, made an attempt one time to enslave by one single onslaught both your country and ours in the whole of the territory of the strait. And then it was Solon, an Egyptian person in this conversation, that the manhood of your state showed itself conspicuous for valor and might in the sight of all the world. For it stood preeminent above all in gallantry and all warlike arts, and acting partly as leader of the Greeks, and partly standing alone by itself when deserted by all others, after encountering the deadliest perils, it defeated the invaders and reared a trophy, whereby it saved from slavery such as were not all as yet enslaved, and all the rest of us who dwell within the bounds of Heracles, it ungrudgingly set free. So this Atlantis island, it's off the coast of Spain at some point, but of course the story changes over the years when people barely understand the points of references used by Plato. Atlantis is placed in many places, including the Caribbean. Again, a kind of a fabled space, but here the fabled space, according to Plato, is much closer to him. And the city-state island of Atlantis has its own kings, has its own political organization. It lives around the ocean, and it has very important contributions, including a military tradition. The context in which Atlantis is brought by Plato is to make sense out of exactly where the Greeks came from and where the Greeks got most of their technology, which was a mystery at the time. There was no good reason why ancient Greece would have got most of its technology if they did not invent it themselves. So, according to Plato's story, told in this book, the origin of this technology is coming from Atlantis, a, ancient civilization that knew basic metalwork, that knew language, that knew agriculture, and that has passed on its knowledge all the way down to ancient Greece, eventually kind of existing as a remnant, as a lost continent somewhere in the distance, which eventually, at least according to the story, attempted to reconquer Greece, but Greece managed to save its way out of this conversation. So here the just like the Darwin fish, the Atlantis continent is kind of this ancient universe, this old artifact of a distant past that exists kind of in our world, but kind of not our world, and a little bit kind of in between our state here. So the perhaps the most important thing that we can note about these mermaids and these merfolks in general is this halfway stage that we have mentioned several times this week, but also the fact that it is quite obvious that a merfolk is a merfolk, that they are not quite hiding themselves, and if they do hide, they will have to stick to either being underwater or on land, but they would not be able um, to successfully blend into our lives. And mermaids lead us to think of a specific word that we haven't used too much this semester, and that's monsters. Monster in the vocabulary is associated with something ugly or horrific of something of the sort, but in a way, monster is something that you can see. It's the same root as the word to demonstrate. So a monster is a thing that shows itself as horrible, that shows itself as horrific. And in the context of putting these merfolk in human zoos, these are monsters. These are things that we are showing for people to see, and there we are displaying their horror, we are displaying their difference to titillate the needs of people. And so the symbolism here is pretty clear in a way that you can see these merfolks in of all shapes and sizes, and you can very clearly mark them as not human, and as also clearly mark them as not animal. You can see that they are occupying this kind of in-between space here. And that might made you think that might make you think a little bit about the what these monsters are exactly, but it is nice to make these statements plain, to make the statement of these merfolk are in fact monsters. And it is also nice when people in our ancient terms also make sense out of this. For example, here this excerpt from the Bishop of Seville, Leander of Seville, who was writing in the 6th century and a letter complaining about the women who do not believe enough in religious solutions and essentially make monsters out of themselves. I beg you, Sister Florentina, not to allow into your company any women who have not made the same profession that you have, for they keep recalling to you the things they like, and they will suggest to your ears the things which are attached to their own pleasures. Alas, my sister, evil companionships corrupt good morals. She is different in dress, different in attitude, an instrument of Satan. She will sing you songs which will stir the attractions of the world and which will cause you to fall into the paths of the devil. Flee the siren song, my sister, lest from the light of receiving into your eyes the enticements of the world, you turn from the straight path and either knot your foot against a rock on the right side or be swallowed up in the whirlpool of Charybdis on the left. Flee the siren song and shut your ears from the tongue of those who persuade evil ways. So the evil women, the women who do not believe in Christianity, according to Seville, to Leander of Seville, are sirens, and they are again using their feminine wiles, their sweet voices, their dreadful magical powers to cheat women, good women, away from Christianity and to put them into compromising situations which they do not want, compromising predicament of having a fishtail alongside your human body. So the the picturing here of bad women as being mermaids, as being halfway to being monsters, and again, right, we're talking about these legends that exist in people's minds, makes people think that there is a possibility of evolving or devolving in the wrong way. Now, at this point in time, when we think of mermaids, as you have pointing out in the message boards, merfolk usually have this magical power to attract people, and sometimes to eat their flesh, or sometimes to capture others, and so they represent this existing danger, or maybe this halfway range to danger, and in a way, through their songs, through their magic, they are able to change us from being the advanced, good Christian people that we are supposed to become, and put us back into this state of nature, the whirlpool of the nature, as where we could be, driving our boats through and using our human technology and our human process to be better. We, on the other hand, are um, letting go of this and following our base instincts. And of course, that is a reading that has not escaped more modern writers here, from Barbara Creed, who writes about a context that she calls the monstrous feminine. Essentially, the strange realization that over the years, there are a lot of women who are portrayed as monsters and a lot of monsters who are portrayed as women. And it doesn't seem to be any good reason for that, except, well, the fact that there are women, I guess, and the stories are written by men. The sirens of classical mythology were described as enormous birds with the heads of women. They used their magical songs to lure sailors close to the shore in order to drive the sailor ships into hidden reefs. The sirens then ate their helpless victims. The Medusa and her two sisters also presented a terrifying sight. They had huge heads, and their hair consisted of writhing serpents, and their teeth were as long as boar's tusks, and they flew through the air on golden wings. Men unfortunate enough to look upon the Medusa with her evil eye were immediately turned to stone. So they occupy this legendary space of being able to break down our boundaries between nature and culture, between Christianity and not Christianity, between good and bad, between human and animal. And in this context, because we have these also sirens that are the sons and daughters of gods, there is this aspect of the god and the not god, the world and the underworld, and whether or not these things are symbols of death, of destruction, or maybe of a sexual urge. This is a lot of what Barbara Creed talks about, and feel free to interpret that any way you want. I'm not a big fan of it, but I'm sure there is some kind of a psychosexual explanation behind all this. At least it's part of the story. But pointing out to these sirens as cannibals, as inhumans, as on the same time femme fatale, sexual objects, kind of shows halfway monsters, halfway human, and really completely out of our world type of characters for the readers, for the people who read these stories. And the resulting goal for the readers is really to find their way through these stories, just like we find our way through Charybdis and Scylla through the ships, just like Odysseus has to find his way through the Song of the Sirens. Barbara Creed was inspired in part by Joseph Campbell and her analysis, and of course Joseph Campbell goes through that same process. The ways and danger of the way of the island of the sun, the dangers of the way were as follows: one, the sirens, b, the clashing rocks or the intolerant route, or Scylla and Charybdis. The first is symbolic of the allure of the beatitude of paradise, or as the Indian mystics say, the tasting of the juice, accepting paradisial bliss as the end, the soul enjoying its subject, instead of pressing through the non-dual transcendent illumination. The other two represent like the ultimate threshold of unitive mystical experience, leading past the pairs of opposites, a passage in experience beyond the categories of logic, A is not B, thou art not that, beyond all forms of perception to a conscious participation in the consciousness inherent in all things. Odysseus chose the route between the pair of opposites, Scylla and Charybdis, and passed through. So, according to Joseph Campbell, the story of the Merfolk is showing us a path through transcendence, a path to not be completely blessed or cursed, not to be a person of perfect valor or a person of very low valor, but a person who is able to see the difference between the two, to recognize the monsters when they show to themselves, but also to be able to indulge ever so enough to survive whatever ordeals we are living in our lives. So in that context, the story of the sirens and their relationship through us, their relationships to their mothers and their fathers, the gods, and their pawns, the humans, is also putting us into this situation of looking at the world and making our way through the world. There's a little side note here that is mentioned in Leander of Seville, whether or not you, again, you subscribe to his idea of Christianity, Catholicism, and all of that, but you might be able to think of another person slash non-person that is represented as part human, part animal, and that would be Satan, of course. Satan with his bat wings, with his goat hooves, is partly animal and has that same representation in many Christian imagery. So it is interesting to see how, especially Christianity, might have influenced our view of sirens, considering that the sirens changed forms from the birds to the fish at some point, and how science might have been part of this conversation as well. This is a different kind of almost fish animal called kappa that exists in Japanese imagery, as you can see them underwater practicing some kind of weird sexual ritual, but definitely a lot more fish-like than the rest of us. The example that appeared in the video that I posted yesterday as well of Mami Wata, which is usually female but sometimes male, kind of like the sirens, but also very much marked as humans. So the connection to Mami Wata as a person that is able to cure others, the connections to the kappa in Japan as a fish that is hurting people, and the fact that, of course, the vision that we have of these monsters is very much the result of cultural forces that are much broader than any single story could really account for.